Hello and welcome to Wednesday in Parliament. The main news from Westminster. Labour demands a big change in tack on funding for social care.
Why doesn't she do something really bold? Cancel the corporation tax cut and put the money into social care instead.
Theresa May accuses previous Labour governments of ducking the issue.
13 years and no action whatsoever.
Also on the programme, the Education Secretary says she's introducing a fairer funding system for schools, but Labour says disadvantaged areas will lose money.
That will mean the one-to-one tuition going, it means the catch-up classes going, it means the extracurricular, the drama, the Shakespeare, all those vital things that I want to see kids in Moss Side and Moston doing will be going as a result of her funding crisis.
But first, it was the last Prime Minister's questions of 2016, and it certainly got off to a jovial start, with a few jokes at the expense of the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson.
Mr Speaker, can I take the opportunity to wish you and all members of the House a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Mr Speaker, in the light of the Foreign Secretary's display of chronic foot and mouth disease, when deciding on cabinet positions, does the Prime Minister now regret that pencilling FO against his name should have been an instruction, not a job offer?
Far too much noise in the chamber. We've heard the question, but I want to hear the Prime Minister's answer. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. First of all, I join the honourable gentleman in wishing everybody a happy Christmas. I will, of course, have an opportunity to do that again on Monday, when I'm sure the House will be as full for the statement on the European Council meeting. Funny, it seems to come from this side, yes, but not from the Labour side. And I have to say that the Foreign Secretary is doing an absolutely excellent job. He is, in short, an FFS, a fine Foreign Secretary.
But it was soon back to serious business, with some spirited exchanges about social care for older and disabled people. The government's set to allow local councils in England to further increase the amount they can raise for social care via council tax, what's known as the social care precept. But the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn thought there was another way.
The Prime Minister doesn't seem to be aware that £4.6 billion was cut from the social care budget in the last Parliament, and that her talk of putting it on to local governments ought to be taken for what it is, a con. 2% of council tax is clearly a nonsense. 95% of councils use this social care precept, and it raised less than 3% of the money they plan to spend on adult social care. Billions seem to be available for tax giveaways to corporations, not mentioned in the autumn statement, underfunded, and many elderly people left isolated and in crisis because of the lack of government's funding of social care.
We see many councils around the country that have taken the benefit of the social care precept and have, as a result, actually seen more people being able to access social care and needs being met. Sadly, there are also some councils across the country, some Labour councils, who haven't taken that opportunity, where we do see a worse performance in relation to social care. But the Right Honourable Gentleman once again refers to the issue of money. I might remind him that at the last election, the then Shadow Chancellor said that if Labour were in government, there would be not a penny more for local authorities, and also that when recently asked about spending more money on social care, the Labour's Shadow Health Secretary said, when he was asked where the money would come from, he said, we're going to have to come up with a plan for that.
Jeremy Corbyn said the impact of raising council tax varied across the country.
For example, if you raise the council tax in Windsor and Maidenhead, you get quite a lot of money. If you raise the council tax precept in Liverpool or Newcastle, you get a lot less. Is she saying that older people, frail elderly, vulnerable people, are less valuable in our big cities than they are in wealthier parts of the country? The crisis affects individuals, it affects families, and it affects the National Health Service. So why doesn't she do something really bold? Cancel the corporation tax cut and put the money into social care instead.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman has quoted Newcastle Council in the list that he set there. I have to say Newcastle Council is one of the councils where we saw in September virtually no delayed discharges. So elderly people were not being held up in hospital when they didn't need to be and when they didn't want to be. So what this shows is that it is possible for councils to deliver on the ground.
Councils work very hard to try to cope with a 40% cut in their budgets across the whole country. And the people who pay the price are those who are stuck in hospital, who should be allowed to go home, and those that aren't getting the care and support they need. This is a social care system that's deep in crisis. The crisis is made in Downing Street by this government. This social care crisis forces people to give up work to care for loved ones because there isn't a system to do it, makes people stay in hospital longer than they should, and leads people into a horrible, isolated life when they should be cared for by all of us through a properly funded social care system. Get a grip and fund it properly, please.
The issue of social care is indeed one that has been ducked by governments for too long. That is why it is this government that will provide a long-term, sustainable system for social care that gives reassurance to people. But when he talks about governments ducking social care, let's look about 13 years of Labour in government. In 1997, they said they'd sort it in their manifesto. They had a Royal Commission in 1999, a Green Paper in 2005, the One List report in 2006. In 2007, in the CSR, they said they'd sort it. In 2009, they had another Green Paper. 13 years and no action whatsoever.
Time now to catch up on the latest twists and turns of Brexit. David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, had his first appearance in front of the committee set up to investigate the UK's exit from the EU.
Now, the Chancellor said on Monday there is an emerging view amongst business, regulators and thoughtful politicians that it would be generally helpful to have a longer period to manage the adjustment as we leave the European Union. Can we classify you, Secretary of State, as a thoughtful politician when it comes to transitional arrangements?
Well, I'm not sure about the second qualification. I hope you can classify me as a thoughtful politician. In that context, let me be clear about where I think we're going. Firstly, as the Prime Minister said a number of times, I said a number of times, what we're after is a smooth and orderly exit. That's the overarching aim. And people get frustrated with us sticking to overarching aims, but the point is that's what we're trying to do. That's the purpose of at least a part of the tactic and strategy of this. And within that box, we want to get the maximum market access for British companies with the minimum of disruption. And so we'll do what's necessary to that aim.
What if all of those things can't be negotiated within it could be 18 months, depending on
what view is
taken?
Mr. Barnier said 18 months.
Yes.
And I think that it is all negotiable in that time. I mean, that's the sort of core of this, really. We have got a lot to do, but that's one of the reasons. I mean, you may have thought perhaps my opening answer wasn't that helpful, but it's one of the reasons that we are taking our time to get prepared on all fronts. That's why our 57 studies cover 85% of the economy, everything except sectors that are not affected by international trade. So we are aiming to get ourselves in a position where we can negotiate within the Article 50 process. After all, the Article 50 process was written to allow departure from the European Union. That's its purpose. And plainly, the architects of it, the authors of it, thought that it was time enough to do the job.
You're watching Wednesday in Parliament with me, Christina Cooper. Labour MPs have criticised plans for a shake-up in the way state schools in England are funded. The government wants to introduce a new formula that places greater emphasis on factors such as sparsity of population when allocating funds.
Our school funding system, as it exists today, is unfair, it's opaque and it's outdated. The reality is that patchy and inconsistent decisions on funding are built up over many years on data that is sometimes a decade or more out of date.
She outlined how the new formula would work.
We're proposing to protect resources for pupils who come from disadvantaged families and are taking a broad view to target £3 billion annually of funding for those most in need of support. Our formula will prioritise not only children in receipt of free school meals, but also those who live in areas of disadvantage, helping to support many more families who are most likely to be just about managing to get by. We'll also protect those small rural schools, which is so important for their local communities, by inclusion of a sparsity factor.
Well done.
Thirdly, alongside a basic amount and an uplift for disadvantage, we'll be directing £2.4 billion a year in funding towards pupils with low prior attainment at both primary and secondary school.
Can the Secretary of State tell the House how exactly a funding formula can be fair when it means that a third of local authorities and around 10,000 schools serving over 2 million children will be losing money? In a period where pupil numbers and inflation is rising in tandem, the pressure on school budgets will continue to increase.
In a constituency like mine, which is a loser under this formula, where I have over 50% of children living in poverty, the second highest constituency in the entire country, losing money to their school budgets, that will mean the one-to-one tuition going, it means the catch-up classes going, it means the extracurricular, the drama, the Shakespeare, all those vital things that I want to see kids in Moss Side and Moston doing will be going as a result of her funding crisis, aside from this announcement today.
And the concern in Liverpool will be that coming on top of substantial cuts to local government funding, our schools will lose out at a time when they're finding it challenging to recruit teachers and head teachers.
She's dressing it up very well, but isn't the reality of what the Secretary of State is announcing today is that some of the schools in the most deprived parts of the country that face the biggest challenges are going to see money taken away from them and that money given to other schools elsewhere? Wouldn't it have been much fairer for her to have gone to the Chancellor and said, have some more money to bring the gap up that way? Instead, what she's making schools in the toughest areas is make teachers redundant to pay for this change.
It's indisputable, absolutely indisputable, that school overheads are going up and more secondary schools are going to go into debt. Why are we continuing to squander money on pointless pet projects and restructuring? Surely it's a huge diversion now.
We've seen year-on-year improvements in our education system. As one of my predecessors said on the Today programme earlier this week, I do think it's important that we continue the reforms that we've already got underway, and that's precisely what we'll be doing.
A Conservative supported the new formula.
Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it starts to address the myth that constituencies like Cheltenham and Gloucestershire do not have areas of deprivation? The reality is that Cheltenham has intense urban challenges, and this starts to address funding on the basis of need and not postcode.
I strongly agree with him. I think that up until now, school funding has been the ultimate postcode lottery. And funding is really overly being determined by where children were growing up. That's completely unacceptable. If we're really going to make Britain, and in this case schools in England, a country for everyone, schools where all children can progress, we have to get on with fair funding.
Staying with education matters, the Lords has been discussing a proposal to enable 10,000 children from low-income families to attend private schools in England. The idea has been mooted by the Independent Schools Council in response to a government consultation on the future of education. The council says that if the government pays around £5,000 a year, the cost of a state school place, private schools would cover the rest.
My Lords, we welcome the positive way in which the Independent Schools Council has responded to the consultation document Schools That Work for Everyone by putting forward a number of proposals for ways in which the independent school sector can achieve the aim of improving access for families to good school places. The consultation period closed on Monday this week, and we are considering all responses received and will publish our response in due course.
My Lords, I declare my interest as a former General Secretary of the Independent Schools Council and current President of the Independent Schools Association, one of the Council's constituent bodies. Has my noble friend noted that the proposals contain plans that are specifically designed to assist social mobility by providing large numbers of new places across the age range based on need and need alone, and no extra cost to the government? So this is not a repetition of the assisted places scheme.
I wonder if the Minister realises how unrealistic this is for areas like the North East, and given that that is one of the prime areas where there needs to be both improvement in education outcomes and in social mobility, it really isn't going to make much effect. We have very few independent schools in the North East, and that's for history reasons, because there's never been enough money around to support them. And on that basis, will the Minister make sure that this is not seen as a realistic issue, a way of addressing what is a very important issue in our part of the country?
I agree entirely with the Noble Lady's comment about the educational issues in the North East. And of course, this isn't a panacea. Only 7% of the population are educated at private schools, and they're predominantly in the south of England. So, as I say, our proposals will have to be practicable.
What this offer reveals is that the cost of educating a pupil in the state sector is about £5,500. Meanwhile, the average cost of private school fees is about 3 times that, which I think is very revealing in terms of the different offers to children in the different sectors. But will the Minister say, if he knows whether or not this offer would be conditional on selection a test being operated to see who were able to take up those places? Because if that happened, would you not agree with me that what would then occur would be not so much that poor children per se were helped, that already bright children themselves were helped to achieve what they would very likely have achieved in the state sector anyway? Will he agree that if selection is to be involved in this offer, that the government should not accept it?
Well, there are a range of proposals being submitted under the consultation document. Some involve selection, some won't, and we will look at them all before we design the final proposals more carefully.
Now, last month there was a brief walkout by prison officers in protest at the escalating violence in jails in England. On that day, the Justice Committee had been due to hear from governors of the 6 reform prisons who've been given greater control over their affairs. That session had to be cancelled because of the walkout, but this time they finally made it. And they reckoned they had a good news story to tell.
We're in the process, for example, of fitting 494 grills to windows in High Down as a deterrent to drones, smuggling of drugs, and actually to ensure that rubbish isn't thrown out the windows. We want a decent environment. I think this is a healthy prison bit, and it starts with having a clean environment where staff and prisoners feel better themselves. So we've done a whole range of things, from the technical stuff right through to the relationship issues. And I think we've seen, I've looked at some of the figures for violence, etc., and we appear to be doing, early days, but we appear to be doing better.
Would you say the way that the government characterises this as the biggest shake-up since the Victorian era is really how it feels in terms of the way your roles have changed?
Well, sure, and there is something really fundamental happening in the way that we run our prisons that is different from how we've run them. All the time I've been in such, you've got well over 100 years worth of prison experience in front of you this morning, and this is feeling significantly different in terms of how we're operating. The biggest single difference at the moment is not having the sense of a line manager telling us what to do and shaping how we're behaving. So that is kind of significantly different.
Prison officers have gone from being something which is prestigious, professionalised, to almost de-skilled and infantilised. I exaggerate to make the point. Do you think that you're going to be in a position to bring back and restore that professional pride, so people can say, I'm going to have career professional development, I'm going to go places, I'm going to become a proper skilled professional in my own right? Is this going to help you do that?
So that's absolutely a fundamental aim of what we're trying to do. I both, in terms of how prisons officers have been seen in the past, I'm not sure they've ever had the respect they deserve at any point that I can think of in the time I've been. And they never get mentioned in the same way, for example, alongside nurses, police officers. Nobody thinks about the fact that there will be thousands of prison officers working on Christmas Day. They'll talk about nurses, they'll talk about police, but they won't talk about prison officers. So I'm not sure they've ever had the respect they deserve for the work that they do.
Prison officers will say they don't want to be locking and unlocking, doing exercise, taking people to education, coming back again and repeating the same stuff in the afternoon. They will absolutely say to you, I think without fail, that they want to be able to engage effectively to help people. Again, we all have our little nuances, I'm sure. My sense of success for us will be when I see prison officers sit on the ends of beds, helping men read and write letters, and then encouraging them to go into education because there's a need there that they've identified. My guys simply don't have time to do that work right now.
I don't think we've ever had such a positive session on prisons. Your enthusiasm is striking, and I think slightly surprising for the committee to hear. To go back to challenges, I am sorry, for a minute. Do you feel that the new freedoms you have are actually helping you with staff relations, for example? Can we deal with that first? It's particularly poignant as you couldn't come last time because of a quite major staff relations issue.
If you remember a staff walking along at A-Wing today, would you feel significantly different? Well, staff facilities have improved a little bit. We've invested in well-being. We've talked about training. We talk about recruitment. We talk about what the regime will look like. But fundamentally, it still feels pretty similar at Wandsworth. It's probably safer, it's less violent, there's less drugs around. But fundamentally, as a prison officer, you don't see more colleagues. And so there is that slowness. But it's been since the 1st of July, so there is a transition to have to make here.
Of course, the really important outcomes around reducing reoffending back in the community and doing that through improved outcomes around housing and employment, those are going to take longer. We would expect to see difference within a couple of years in those outcomes, and much more immediately in terms of the impact. So more education, more work, more time out, and therefore less violence, less drugs. Those are things that we need to see much more quickly in a matter of weeks and months.
Bringing the session to a close, the committee chairman, the Conservative Bob Neal, wished the witnesses luck in their role as trailblazers for the new regime. Now, the United States is going to limit arms sales to Saudi Arabia over concerns about civilian casualties during the conflict in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is conducting airstrikes in Yemen in a bid to help the government put down a rebellion. The SNP leader at Westminster is putting pressure on the UK government to follow the American lead.
The US government has just said that, and I quote, "systematic endemic problems in Saudi Arabia's targeting drove the US decision to halt a future weapons sale involving precision-guided munitions." The Saudis have UK-supplied precision-guided Paveway 4 missiles. They're made in Scotland. The UK has licensed £3.3 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia since the beginning of the bombing campaign. What will it take for the UK to adopt an ethical foreign policy when it comes to Yemen?
Well, as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, the intervention in Yemen is a UN-backed intervention. As I've said previously, where there are allegations of breaches of international humanitarian law, then we require those to be properly investigated. We do have a relationship with Saudi Arabia. The security of the Gulf is important to us, and I would simply also remind the Right Honourable Gentleman that actually Saudi intelligence, the counter-terrorism links we have with Saudi Arabia, the intelligence we get from Saudi Arabia has saved potentially hundreds of lives here in the UK.
Now, as a turbulent year draws to a close, the late MP Jo Cox is very much in the thoughts of her colleagues. This coming Friday, it's exactly 6 months since the Labour MP was murdered in her constituency. As a tribute to Jo Cox, the parliamentary rock band MP4, along with several pop stars, have released a single. It's a cover of the Rolling Stones song, You Can't Always Get What You Want. Proceeds from the downloads will go to the Jo Cox Foundation.
Sadly, Mr. Speaker, our late colleague Jo Cox will not be celebrating Christmas this year with her family. She was murdered and taken from us. So I hope the Prime Minister, I'm sure she will, join me in encouraging people to download the song which many members helped to create as a tribute to Jo's life and work and in everlasting memory of her. Yeah.
Well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise this issue. I'm sure everybody in this House, we should send a very clear message. Download this single for the Jo Cox Foundation. It's a very important cause. We all recognise that Jo Cox was a fine member of this House and would have carried on contributing significantly to this House and to this country had she not been brutally murdered. It's right, I think the Chancellor's waiving the VAT on this single. I think everybody involved in it has, in fact, gave their services for free. I'm having a photograph with MP4 later this afternoon.
Pete Wishart is a member of MP4.
And once again, let's just encourage everybody to download this single.
There were rave reviews from the Speaker, who called MP4 an outstanding band. Well, that's it from Wednesday in Parliament, but do join me at the same time tomorrow for another roundup of the news from Westminster. Until then, from me, Christina Cooper, goodbye.